how can you predict the outcomes of genetic crosses?
There are two ways how we can predict the outcomes of genetic crosses. First simple method is Punnett square. Punnett square was developed by Reginald Punnett at the beginning of 20th century. What Mendel used for predicting results of his genetic crosses was the probability. Probability is the likelihood of the occurrence of particular event, and we will spend most of time in this recording focusing on probability and how to use it to predict outcome of genetic crosses and how to use it to develop branched diagrams. So let's first discuss very briefly Punnett square. This picture shows a backcross performed by Mendel to define characteristic of offsprings of the cross, where he took one of the offspring, meaning one of the F1 generation, and backcross it with one of the parents. So what is backcross? Backcross is cross where you take one of the offsprings and cross it with one of the parents, regardless which one. Now, how do you construct Punnett square? It's very easy. First, you define what kind of gametes each individual you cross can form. Heterozygous individual is right here. What kind of gametes? It can form two gametes. One will have a dominant allele and another one will carry recessive allele. Second individual, which is homozygous recessive, would form identical gamete. Each gamete would carry recessive allele. So once you define the alleles that each individual can form, now you plot them against each others into Punnett square. So this is individual number 1, which was heterozygous. This is homozygous recessive. You cross them and you get outcome of each cross. And what you can see here, that two offsprings will be tall and two offsprings will be short. So you got ratio 1:1. Now, here in this picture is a backcross. In this particular case, backcross shown here is actually test cross. So what is test cross and where do we use it? So let's say you are breeding pea plants and you only want tall plants. So you try to get only tall offsprings without any possibility to get a short one. So what is your goal is to select for crossing only individuals which are homozygous dominant. However, if you have tall plants, you have two possibilities. They can be either homozygous dominant or they can be heterozygous. So how do you define whether a phenotypically dominant individual is homozygous dominant or heterozygous? And answer is performing test cross. You test cross this individual against or with homozygous recessive tester. So if you use homozygous recessive, this cross will actually allows you to reveal genotype of phenotypically dominant plant. So what would be outcome? Let's say you cross, your plant is homozygous dominant. Only kind of gamete it would form are dominant gametes. The gamete of this individual all will carry dominant allele. So if you cross this individual with tester, which will only form recessive gametes, all offsprings will be heterozygous. So all offspring would have unified phenotype. All will be tall. Okay. Now, what if your phenotypically dominant individual is heterozygous and you cross it with tester? So in this case, this individual can form two kind of gamete. One will carry dominant allele, another will carry recessive allele, and you cross it with tester who will form only recessive allele. Gametes which would form only carry only recessive alleles. So what would be outcome of this cross? If you cross this individual, you will have heterozygous individual which would be tall, and you will have homozygous recessive which would be short. So we will get tall and short in ratio 1:1. So if your phenotypically dominant individual was homozygous dominant, all the offsprings of test cross will have dominant phenotype. If that individual was heterozygous, result of test cross will yield ratio 1:1. One half would be phenotypically dominant and one half will be phenotypically recessive. Let's now talk about probability and its use in predicting genetic outcomes. So we know that the probability defines the likelihood of occurrence of a particular event. If you want to use probability, you have to know or you have to determine something about the event, either how it occurs or how often it occurs. Let's start with how often it occurs. Let's say you want to define how many boys are born in certain country, in certain months and certain day over years. So you do the statistic, you observe the event, and you make a large number of observations. So you determine empirically what is a probability based on this large number of observation. It's very tedious and usually we don't use that. What we use is different way where you actually know how the event occurs. It's very easy to define it if you on six-sided die. You see, if you throw the die, you know that it's only 1 out of 6 possibility that you will throw 4 or you will throw 5 or so on. Now, what about genetic crosses? Let's ask question. What is the probability that if you want to have 2 children, both will be boys? So you have to know how the event occurs. So you have to, so how it can occur. So basically, obviously, you have to know the cross. Female, the genotype is XX, it's a female. So crossing with male, which is XY. So what kind of gametes female make? Only gametes carrying X chromosomes. Males carry 2 kind of gametes or can form 2 kind of gametes. One will contain X and one would contain Y. So if you cross, meaning after reproduction, what is the probability to have boys or girls? So X, X, XY, XX, XY. So what would be the offsprings? XX, XX, XY, and XY. So basically very easy. XX and XY is 1:1 ratio. So the probability to have first child boy is 50%. Okay. Probability of having second child boy is also 50%. Probability, and every time the gamete are formed, there is the same chance that during fertilization a random gamete will fuse. There is no memory in this. So there is 50% probability to have first child boy and there is 50% probability to have second child boy. Now, what is the probability to have both of them boys? And there we come to the rule which is called rule of multiplication. So what is multiplication rule and where do we use it? Multiplication rule is used to define probability of 2 events occurring at the same time or one after another. Now keep in mind that in order to apply multiplication rules, this event we refer to must be independent. Their occurrence must be independent of each other. So occurrence of first event does not affect occurrence of second. So let's go to our example. Our question was, what is the probability that if you want to have two children, both of them will be boys? So what does it mean? That first child will be boy and the second one. So, and this is the magic word of multiplication rule. If you don't know whether you apply multiplication or another rule of probability addition, you always ask how it happened. If you have to ask whether even number 1 and even number 2 have to occur, whether it is and, it is always multiplication. So in this case, you ask about two children being boys. So what, how you proceed in this particular case? So you ask, what is the probability that your first child will be boy and your second child will be boy? So we know already that first child, to having first child boys, the probability is 50%, 1/2, and also second child will be boy. So if you apply multiplication, the probability, you multiply probabilities to have first child boy and second child boy. So what is the outcome? It is 1/4. So the probability to have both children boys is 25%. So if you, as I stress again and I repeat, if you don't know whether you can apply multiplication rule to define probability of certain event to occur, ask whether it is first event and the second which have to occur. If it is first and the second, you apply multiplication rule. Second rule we can use to predict outcome of genetic crosses using probability is addition rule. So where do we use addition rule? Let's say you ask question, what is the probability to get number 3 or number 4 once you throw your die one time? So addition rule is used when you ask about occurrence one of two alternative events. In this case, what you use, you have to define probability of occurrence of first event and probability of occurrence of second event, and you have to calculate by addition rule alternation of these two events. So let's go to our example. This time let's ask, what is the probability to have both children of the same sex? Meaning, what is the probability that you will have either both children boys or both children girls? So how do you approach this question? First, you calculate probability of each individual event occurrence. First, you calculate what is the probability of first event, meaning that you will have two boys. So we use multiplication rule to define probability of having first child boy multiplied by second child boy, and you get probability of having two children being boys using multiplication rule. The same you apply for second scenario where two children will be girls. You use multiplication rule to calculate probability of having two children girls. So you define these two events. However, the question now is, what is the probability of having two children of the same sex? So what is the question? They can be either boys or girls. So there are alternative sides. They can be either or. In this case, whenever you ask whether either one event occurs or another event occurs, so it can be either one of them, you use addition rule. So what you do in this case, you add together probability of having two children boys and you add probability to have two children girls, and you will end up in 2 quarters, which equals 1/2. Okay, so the probability to have two children of the same sex is 50%. So keep in mind, I repeat again, magic word for addition rules to apply it is either or. We can actually use probability to define outcome of very simple crosses and use it instead of Punnett square. Why you would like to do it? It's very fast and it's very simple. Let's ask a question. You perform cross where you cross two tall plants which are both heterozygous. So you ask, what is the probability of obtaining homozygous dominant progeny? You remember you like tall plants. So how do you approach this solution? You have to know how this happens, how event happens. And you know, in order to get homozygous dominant, this offspring had to get dominant allele from each of the parents. Let's say this was father and this was mother. So now, if you know how it happens, you calculate probability of happening such this event. So from first parent, what was the probability? What is the probability to get the dominant allele? It is 1/2. What is the probability to get dominant allele from second parent? It's also 1/2. So what is the probability to get homozygous dominant? So you have to have first gamete containing dominant allele and the second gamete containing dominant allele. So you apply multiplication rule, 1/2 by 1/2, and the outcome, the result is 1/4 or 25%. Now you can also very simply define what is the probability to obtain all dominant phenotype out of this cross regardless of the genotype. What does it mean? So they can be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So under this scenario, you have to calculate probability of obtaining each of this event, meaning homozygous dominant, we just calculated that probability to get homozygous dominant is 1/4. Afterwards, you calculate probability that the offspring receive dominant allele from first parent and recessive allele from second. So probability is again 1/2 by 1/2, which is 1/4. Third scenario possibility of how this even occurs is to receive recessive allele from first parent and dominant from second one, and probability is again the same 1/4. And the last scenario is that the offspring receive recessive allele from each parent, and you have this probability calculated. Now you ask, what is the probability to obtain offsprings with dominant phenotype regardless of genotype? So what it can be? It can be either homozygous dominant or first heterozygous or third heterozygous. So all these three are possible. So it can be either or. So would you apply rule of addition, not multiplication, but rule of addition, and you add probability of each separate event, you add them together, and you obtain 3/4 or 75% is probability to receive dominant progeny regardless of the genotype. So you can see a probability, using probability, multiplication and addition rule is very easy and simple, and you can approach and solve the problem much faster using probabilities than Punnett square. So up to now we were just discussing prediction, or how to predict outcome of very simple crosses. However, sometimes you will face a problem with much more complex questions, such as this one. Question here is, if you have two parents which are heterozygous, what is the probability to have out of 3 children, 1 with albinism and 2 with normal pigmentation? Now I would like to stress that there are many different different forms of albinism. But for this purpose, we would just consider the simple one, which is autosomal recessive, in which the children or albinos are not able to produce melanin. So let's go to our question. So what you have to do first, you have to know, you have to know how the event happened. So how you can get child which is albino if both parents are heterozygous. So first things which you have to do is to predict outcome of this cross. And we already know that if you cross two heterozygous, there are 3/4 of offspring will have dominant phenotype. It means in this case they would have normal pigmentation, and 1/4 will be homozygous recessive, so 1/4 of offspring will be albino. So now let's go back to the question. First you have to realize that to answer this question you have to consider all possible ways how this can happen. So what do I mean? Let's say you ask what is the probability to have one child out of 3 albino. So basically 3 children, child number 1, child number 2, and child number 3. So let's consider what are the possibilities, what are the way how this can happen. You can actually have scenario where first child will be albino, second will be normal, and third will be normal. Or you can have scenario where first child will be normal, second one will be albino, and third one will be normal. Or you can have scenario where first child will be normal, second one will be normal, and third one will be albino. So you have calculate probability for each scenario to happen. So let's start with first scenario. So what is the probability to have first child albino? What is the probability to have albino? It's 1/4. What is the probability to have child with normal pigmentation? Is 3/4. Normal pigmentation 3/4. So what is the probability to have this scenario happening? So under this scenario, first child will be albino, and the second child will be normal, and the third child will be normal. So what do? You apply rule of multiplication, 1/4 by 3/4 by 3/4, which is 9/64 out of 64. Now what is the probability of second scenario happening? Normal child probability to have normal child is 3/4, albino 1/4, normal 3/4. Total probability of this scenario happening is 9 out of 64. The last scenario to have child with normal pigmentation 3/4, second one normal pigmentation 3/4, fourth one 1/4 albino. So again we have 9 out of 64 probability that each of this scenario happen. Now read carefully the question. It does not ask about order. It just asks what is the probability to have one albino child out of 3. So how it can happen? It can be either scenario number 1 or scenario number 2 or scenario number 3. So what do? You use addition rule to calculate the probability, which would be 964 plus 964 plus 964, which is actually 27 out of 64. So probability to have one child albino out of 3 children is 27 out of 64. The last thing I would like to discuss is how to use the binomial to solve problem such as this one, what is the probability that 2 out of 5 children will have albino? You see, this is much more complicated and complex problem, so you have to use binomial to solve this problem. Before you construct binomial, you have to define how this even happen, how you get albino child. And we again consider very simple form of albinism, which is autosomal recessive. So let's consider that both parents are heterozygotes. So how it happened to have an albino? The offspring has to be homozygous recessive, and probability to have this outcome is 1/4. What is the probability to have child with normal pigmentation? The child has to have at least one dominant allele, which means probability is 3/4. Now, you have to define in binomial what is the probability of child having albinism. It is 1/4, and you assign to this probability letter P. A probability of having child with normal pigmentation is 3/4. You see, we come from here, and you assign it to letter Q. So now let's construct binomial P plus Q, and you actually expand it, or you power it to n. So what is n? N equals to number of events. So number of event here are 5. We are looking for 5 children, so there are 5 events. So it would be P plus Q power to 5. Now, how do you expand it? First thing, you have to define how many terms you will have. So number of terms in this expansion will equal to n plus 1. So number of terms will be 6. So number of terms is n plus 1, which is 6. So we will have 6 terms: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, what you define first is the exponents. So let's start with P, probability of children having albinism. So P, first term, this probability has always exponent corresponding to the power to which binomial is raised, so it will be 5. Every successful successor will have exponent decreased by 1. So next P will be 4, following one will be 3, and following one will be 2, P1, and the last one will be P to 0, which is 0. Now, for Q, it goes opposite way. So first Q will be Q to 0 here, which obviously is 0. Following one would be Q to 1. Next one will be Q to 2, Q to 3, Q to 4, and last one would be Q to 5. Okay? Now, let's, as a last part, define the coefficients. You can calculate coefficient in expansion by 2 different ways, either using Pascal triangle, or second way I will show you here, you calculate it from this expansion. So if you use the second way, the first coefficient always correspond to 1. Second coefficient always correspond to power to which binomial is raised, so it will be 5. Third one, actually this coefficient you calculate from previous term. And what you do, you multiply previous coefficient by first exponent, which is 5 by 4, which is 20, and divided by position of this term in expansion. So it's second position, divided by 2, and it is 10. So following coefficient will be 10. The next one you also calculate from previous one the same way. So you multiply coefficient 10 by exponent of P, which is 3, which is 30, and divided by position, which is 1, 2, 3, divided by position third, which is again it is 10. So coefficient here is again 10. You calculate the same way as this one. So how the calculation would be, you multiply coefficient 10 by p exponent, which is 2, which is 20, and divide by position. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. Fourth position, 20 divided by 4 is 5. So basically coefficient here would be 5. And the same for the last one, where you also calculate from previous one, and the calculation will be coefficient is 5 multiplied by p is 1, which is 5, divided by position 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth position, and you get number 1. So this is expansion. This is how you expand binomial. Now, question is, which of these terms you use to calculate to answer the question? What is the probability that 2 out of 5 children will have albinism? What you focus here are exponents. First exponent, let's look at first term, p to 5. P corresponds to probability of children having albinism. Now, P to 5 mean that under this scenario, all 5 children will be albino. What about second term? Here, you have in second term, P is 4, so 4 out of 5 children will be albino, and Q is 1, exponent is 1. So basically 1 out of 5 children will be children with normal skin pigmentation. Let's look at the third term, where we have P3 and Q to 2. So under this scenario, probability of having albino child is P, so 3 children will be albino and 2 will have normal pigmentation, because Q is normal pigmentation. So which term is ours? What do we ask? We ask that what is the probability that out of 5 children, 2 will be albino? What does it mean? 2 will be albino and 3 will have normal pigmentation. And here we come. This is a term we use to calculate probability answering the question we ask. P is power to 2. It means 2 children will be albino, and Q is power to 3, means the 3 children will have normal pigmentation. So let's take into account this. Let's calculate this term. 10 times P to 2 and Q to 3. So what do you plug into this term? P is probability of child having albinism, so this probability is 1/4 and it's power to 2. Q is probability to having children with normal pigmentation, which is 3/4 power to 3, because 3 children are expected to have normal pigmentation and 2 children are expecting being albino. And you calculate this equations, and basically what you get as outcome is 270 out of, I think it's 1024, which if you divide it, it comes to 0.26, which gives you 26% probability. So using this binomial expansion, you can actually define much more complex problem, and actually you can approach much more complex problems. This slide just outlines how to construct Pascal triangle. You remember in previous slide we look at binomial expansion, and our coefficients were 1, 5, 10, 10, 5, and 1, and we had, you remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 terms, and we had number of evens 5. So you can very easily, once you expand Pascal triangle, to look in a number of even and 5, and you will see you will get exactly the same coefficients, 1, 5, 10, 10, 5, and 1. So it's up to you which way you select or you will use to define coefficient for binomial expansion. This table just shows you phenotypic ratio for simple genetic crosses. Three of them you can very easily remember, and which allows you to actually deduct genotypes of parents. Similarly, if you are interested in genotypic ratios, this table shows you three basic, very simple ratios that you can very easily remember. So that's all for this part of recordings, and in the next one, the last one, I will outline very shortly usage of chi-square in genetics.